Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in Game 10 of our coverage, the 1972 World Chess Championship between Bobby Fischer and Spassky, deemed the match of the century. Up until this point, Bobby Fischer holds a 2-game advantage, but Spassky hasn't even won a game since game number 2, when Bobby Fischer didn't even show up. So, Spassky won game 1 and 2. Since then, Bobby Fischer has rattled off 4 wins, and then they've drawn some here and there. So in game 10, Bobby Fischer is going to be looking to extend that lead, but Spassky is going to be looking to get back on the horse and at least draw with the black pieces. Definitely does not want to go down 3 games. If he can come up with a pretty creative defense and get a victory, that would also be good as well. So we'll start out Bobby Fischer, pawn to e4. Always like to be very aggressive. Pawn to e4 is favorite opening. Pawn to e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, getting into the right Lopez. Very common at this time. Pawn to a6, getting into the Morphy defense. Bishop back here, a4. Knight to f6, both sides just developing pieces. Castle on the king side. Bishop e7, getting ready to castle on the king side as well. Rook to e1, protecting the pawn on e4. Pawn to b5, forcing the bishop back here to b3. Pawn d6, pawn c3, getting ready to push forward on d4. These are sort of the main lines in the Rai Lopez. Castle on the king side, pawn to h3. And this is where we do kind of shift into a variation we don't always see, and that's the Breyer variation. That's the knight coming back to b8. This opens up the door for the pawn to push forward to c5 if black ever wants to counterattack on the queen side. Also allows him to later bring his knight to d7 to protect the square on e5. This is a very important square in this opening. What's interesting is this really came to be very popular in the 1960s, brought about by Spassky. He knows this opening better than anyone. So you have Bobby Fischer playing the white pieces, a very aggressive opening in the Rai Lopez. And then you have Spassky on playing the black pieces, who knows this defense better than anyone. So we're definitely going to have an exciting match today. Pawn here to d4, just ready to attack the center of the board. He could have played a little quieter with pawn to d3. That's just not Bobby Fischer style. Pawn here to d4, and the knight to d7, as we talked about, defending the square here on e5. Fischer continues with knight to d2, bishop b7, just continuing development, putting more pressure on the central squares, with the bishop attacking the square here on e4. A bishop back here to c2, defending the square a little bit more. A rook to e8, just getting involved into the center of the board. That's exactly what you want to do. And then pawn up here to b4. Bishop back here, f8, and so black has a few options. If he wanted to, he could play bishop to f8 as he did, and then open up the door for this rook here on e8 to defend the square here on e5. But he also could just been a little bit more aggressive. He could have said, let's start gobbling up material. Pawn takes on d4. We see a recapture, pawn to c5, really starting to attack on the queen side. After some exchange on board, pawn to e5, Bobby Fischer starting to push on the king side. Over here, we can see pawn to c4 if we wanted to. After the knight moves, it is under attack right now, but really starting to attack on the queen side and put some pressure on Bobby Fischer. But in the game, we saw bishop to f8, opening up the door for a rook to defend here on e5. Pawn to a4, so Bobby Fischer says, yeah, I can attack on the king side, but I'll go ahead and attack on the queen side as well. Knight to b6, not doing too much after the pawn to a5. That's just going to force the knight back here to d7. Bishop to b2, just get involved into the action. Queen over here, b8. I don't know that this does too much for Spassky's position. It's not really helping too much of his material. He could have even tried getting his rook involved. Rook to c8 if he ever does want to start to push forward. Pawn to c5 I think eventually should happen. This is just going to give him an extra defender as he starts to push up the c file. But he decides to play queen to b8, a rook to b1, just getting a little bit more active, and then pawn to c5. This is why I think it makes total sense to have your rook here on c8. But he does not, so alas, pawn takes on c5, a pawn takes, now pawn takes here on e5, a knight takes, and then after the knight takes, we see the queen come down, and so this is kind of what he had all along. The queen takes here on e5, and then we see a lot of attackers on this square here on e4. Part of it, I just want to see how many actual arrows I could get on the screen. I could try more, but this is what I had on here for now. So the queen, rook, knight, and bishop. So 4 attackers on the square here on e4. Right now, white has three defenders, bishop, knight, and rook. So he has to find a creative way to actually defend this. And he does find a creative way. If you kind of look at it and say, okay, well, let's go ahead and get the queen involved into the action. Queen to f3 is kind of weird. After queen to f3, bishop to d6, that's kind of threatening this queen over here to h2. That's going to be extremely bad. Pawn to g3, trying to stop that. Pawn to c4 over here, just making sure there's no shenanigans with the pawn pushing forward. Discovered attack from the bishop onto the queen here on e5. But then you still see, rook to e2, bishop down here, a c5, putting a lot of pressure. All of a sudden, white's kind of playing defense. That's not what he wants to do. So he found a pretty creative way to defend it, and that's pawn here to c4. And that's attack the biggest piece, which is kind of at the forefront of this attack with the bishop here on b2. So nice little attack from him. Queen to f4. There are still a lot of errors, but I'm not pointing them at the pawn right now. But then we say, okay, let's go ahead and start taking material off the board. If you're going to attack this pawn, I can't really defend it with too much more, so I'm just going to start gobbling up material. Bishop takes on f6, queen takes, pawn takes here on b5, rook over here to d8. And this is a pretty creative way to kind of attack this pawn right here. The knight was defending it. Instead of just having the bishop and the rook attacking it, says, I'm going to bring your rook over here. Your knight can't move anywhere. So nice little variation right here. Queen to c1. Now the knight can move if he wants to. Queen down here to c3, attacking both the rook and the queen are attacking. And then knight up here to f3. But this is pretty good move for Bobby Spassky, because now he can just come in and take this pawn on a5. Now Bobby Fischer plays what I think is an incredible move. He plays bishop to b3. If you look at material, material is equal right now, but he could easily just take pawn takes on a6. Makes a lot of sense. Bishop can recapture if he wants to. This seems fine. Seems low risk. He would be in fine position. But plays bishop to b3 and says, I'll give up material if I need to. And that's exactly what happened. So pawn takes on b5, but he has other things in mind. Queen to f4, attacking this pawn here on f7, and so decides to play rook to d7 to protect this. I think he maybe could have tried pawn to c4. I like this a little bit better. Really negates a lot of the pressure this light square bishop plays on the square on f7. But all in all, he played rook to d7. I don't know that's a lot worse, but I just do prefer just defending with my pawns, letting my major pieces play more of an active role instead of just defending. But then we see the knight come up here to e5, and this is another opportunity to see how many arrows I can get on board. We see the bishop, knight, and queen all attacking this. And only the rook and the king. You never want your king to be one of the pieces that's defending a very, very important square on the board. And so we see the queen come up here to c7 to try to defend this. And then we see rook over here to d1, attacking the rook, putting more pressure. And then rook over here to e7. There's just not a ton of great options on board. You can see rook here to e7. You could also maybe see rook over here to d8. That's kind of the only options that he has. He decides for rook here to e7, a bishop to f7. He kind of has to take with the rook. If he says king to h8, then all of a sudden knight to g6. Pawn takes, queen over here to h4. That is going to be checkmate. So he correctly decides, I need to go ahead and take that with my rook on f7, but then the queen takes, then the knight takes, and then the bishop comes down here. If he were to take with his king here on f7, then all of a sudden a rook up here, d7, after the king moves, the bishop's going to fall, and then this rook is very active, starting to attack these pawns on the board. We do see a similar state after the bishop comes down here, then the rook takes, the king comes here to f7, rook up here to d7 after the king moves, then the rook comes over here to b7. So if we look at both sides of the board, Bobby Fischer has a slight advantage. Rooks definitely play better at the end of the game together than just a bishop and a rook. Black does have one extra pawn, but they are on different sides of the board. It's going to be difficult to kind of hang on to all the pressure Bobby Fischer can really put on his opponent. What Black really needs to do is start pushing these pawns. That's his really only way to win this. He's not going to overpower him with his pieces. Bobby Fischer, he has two main objectives. One is to make sure these pawns don't push forward. And the second one is to start to exchange some of these pawns on the board and then just put more pressure on his opponent on the king side, where that he can either trade off some of these materials and get advantage with his pawns, or just have a passed pawn that he can start to push forward on the king side. But Spassky starts out with rook to a1 check, king to h2, bishop to d6, so being fairly aggressive. Bishop here to d6, pawn here to g3, and then pawn to b4. So nice little pawn chain here, being protected by the bishop as well. So then Bobby Fischer decides to get to work. So king to g2, pawn h5, a rook here to b6, and this does stop the bishop from really moving anywhere since it is being tied down to the king. Rook over here to d1, getting ready to play rook to d5, which I think is a really good defensive move. King to f3, and then king up to f7. And I don't really like this move. Getting your king away from the action, I don't think is the plan. I get that the bishop is tied down to it. He may want this bishop to get more involved than it is right now. But rook up here to d5 makes way more sense. Then he can get his king a little bit more aggressive if he wants to. He does have some protection with his rook involved. But king over here to e2, attacking the rook. Now the rook comes to d5. I think it's a little bit too late. Pawn to f4, pawn to g6. For some reason, Spassky wants to attack on the king side. It's not going to go that well. After the exchange on board, pawn to g5, a pawn to f5, and now we do see a pass pawn on the f-file for white to go ahead and start to attack. Bishop to e5, and then rook to b5. Really nice defense from Bobby Fischer as far as these pawns can't move anywhere. If this pawn moves, the rook's going to fall. If this pawn moves, the pawn's just going to fall. Really, Spassky's kind of in a tough spot. He decides to play king to f6, but then rook over here to b4. The pawn can't recapture. This was the sole pawn defending this square, or else the rook would fall. So Bobby Fischer just gobbling up material right here. Bishop down here to d4. It's a nice little outpost. It's not really doing too much on the board. Rook to b6, attacking the king. King up here to f3. And this is a nice square because the bishop can't attack it. Now the rook can't attack it either. So it's a very safe square for the king, and also just more aggressive on board from Bobby Fischer. Rook up here to d8. Would like to get behind his opponent, maybe bring it over here to this first rank right here. Bobby Fischer's not having any of it though. Rook up here, b8. Says, hey, if you want to exchange on board, that's going to be fine with me. I'll have a rook, you have a bishop. I can start to push this pawn up the board, and you can't really stop me. A rook to b7. Says, hey, let's go ahead and exchange. Rook here to b6, but Spassky says, okay, I'm kind of tired of doing this. Rook to b7 or d7, and that's exactly what Bobby Fischer wants. Now I can bring his rook over here to g6, attacking this pawn, and then after king to d5, a rook g5, and Bobby Fischer is just annihilating this endgame. He's taking two of the pawns on the king side in exchange for one of his pawns, and taking one of the pawns over here on the queen side. And Spassky hasn't even moved his pawns. Early on, he just played pawn to b4, solidify the pawn chain, and that was it. Nothing else has happened except Bobby Fischer's kind of run over him. Bishop here to e5, pawn up here to f6, saying, hey, nice try, but now you can't take this pawn because your bishop is being pinned down to the king. King down here to d4. Rook to b1, and then after this rook to b1, this is the game, but Spassky decides to go ahead and resign. Everyone always asks me, can you go through some of the variations of what might happen? If the bishop moves here, well, it's definitely lost cause. Well, they're all kind of lost causes, but rook here to f5, doesn't really matter where the rook or the bishop moves to, then the rook is going to fall. Rook down here to d1, check, and then this rook's going to fall. Because the bishop's not a light square, it can't protect this rook. If for some reason we say, instead of the bishop taking, let's say rook to, f7, let's try to put more pressure on this. We don't want this pawn to push any further on the board. Then all of a sudden, rook to d1. The king doesn't have tons of great options because, as we talked about before, this king on f3 is a great square, blocking off a lot of the squares the king can go to. So once the king moves, all of a sudden, rook to e5, taking that bishop. This pawn is going to be going as well, and there's too much pressure for Bobby Fischer. So he is now up 3 games after 10 games after giving up the first 2. So congratulations to Bobby Fischer in Game 10. I think one of the most exciting matches or games in this whole match that we've had, really, really crazy lines that you don't see very often. Bobby Fischer in the in-game played some of the best in-game chess I have ever seen. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this exciting game, and I will see you guys in game number 11. Thanks for watching.